Do you think we need to teach web development in a different way than we might teach classical computer science?
We need to teach things differently, at least differently than I learned it, because I almost didn't become a programmer because it was so bad. I do not think that I use any of my knowledge of that on a regular basis at all. So I do have some knowledge of DSAs, but I don't really feel myself reaching to that knowledge very often at all.
I guess, like, what are those core principles for web development? Like, what are those things that you should know?
Wherever you are in software development, I think it's a good idea to understand the level that you operate at and one or two layers below.
If you could invest in one company, who would it be? Hey folks, welcome back to Software Huddle, and we got a great guest today because Kent C Dodds is here. If you don't know Kent, he's a well-known expert in JavaScript, web development, and teaching. His courses like Testing JavaScript, Epic, React, and Epic Web Dev have helped countless developers uplevel their skills and develop whole new ones. During our conversation, we discussed how he got a start in creating courses and the background on his latest project, Epic Web Dev. I also picked his brain about JavaScript. And why the heck do we have so many JavaScript frameworks? Are we just perpetually dissatisfied with what we have? Or is there a fundamental problem with how the web is actually designed? There's a lot of meat in the bone on this one, and I hope you enjoy it. And of course, if you do, let Alex and I know by contacting us on social or leaving a positive rating or review. All right, let's get you over to the interview with Kent C Dodds. Kent, welcome to Software Huddle.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. So you're, in many ways, in some circles, a pretty well-known guy, I think, especially in the world of, JavaScript, web development. I'm kind of interested, like, what is your background on how you became involved in like creating courses and a content creator and building up an audience in a space as you and turned it into a business, moving away from maybe the day-to-day sort of software engineering you've done in the past?
That's interesting. So I pretty much was doing both jobs for a long time. I have always been teaching and sharing the knowledge that I have with coworkers or at meetups and conferences and even giving workshops. Even while I was working, it was just a couple months after graduating with a degree in information systems that I started working on courses, and on egghead.io was where I first started publishing, and then I started traveling around for conferences and stuff. So it's always been kind of a part of what I've done. Just something I really enjoy is teaching, and so the transition from doing that as a part-time thing to doing that as a full-time thing really was a natural step for me, because I in the years that I was working as an individual contributor or team lead at various companies, I one day decided, hey, I've got like a lot of information about testing and lots of workshops that I could put together. I was going to make a bunch of courses on Egghead, and they reached out and said, hey, how about instead of just doing a bunch of courses on Egghead, we do a special site just for you, just for your stuff. And I said, that sounds interesting. So we created testingjavascript.com, and that went super well. And I made more than my PayPal salary just from that. And so I was like, well, I don't need 2 PayPal salaries. I'm doing just fine. And so, and I would prefer to get my evenings back. And so, so I decided to go full-time as an educator from that. And so, it was kind of a natural step. Like, there wasn't really a lot of risk involved because I had been doing it for like 6 years already. And I knew that it was working, and it could only work better if I had more time to do it. Yeah.
And you have a skill set that's highly marketable. So even if it did fail, you could probably go and get another, job as a software engineer.
Yeah, exactly. Certainly, like back then, that was 2019, I think. The beginning of 2019 is when I left PayPal. And back then it was just like, well, what's the worst that can happen? I go get a job. These days, I think that's a little less certain, or at least it's a little more difficult. I do think that the economy is coming back and everything, but there's still, big tech layoffs and whatnot. But that actually is part of the reason why, or something that I realized as I built a following online, that having a following online and presenting this perception or making sure that people had this perception of me being a really skilled engineer was a big part of job security, and making it so that if I did ever need to get a job, that people would know who I am and know that I'm good at this stuff and that they want to work with me. So yeah, there was a lot less risk certainly back then, but even today, I feel like if this education thing wasn't working out, I could go and get a job because the perception people have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you are the creator of Epic React and a number of other courses, and you have a sort of newer, I think, ambitious project around Epic Web Dev. Can you tell me a little bit about like what inspired this project? How is it different than maybe Epic React, and what problem you're trying to address, and what's sort of the current state?
Yeah, sure. So testing JavaScript, as I mentioned, was kind of like a bunch of egghead courses. And those egghead courses are typically just watch me do this thing and take notes and then go apply it to your own project. And while that works really well, what I found was that I was always doing I would have a egghead version of my material, and then I have a workshop version of my material. And I found that the workshop version it helped people's retention a lot better than just like watch me do it and then do it yourself later. And so I actually put together a workshop for testing Node applications that I added to testing JavaScript a year after its initial release. And that was like, basically, I recorded myself as if I was giving a workshop to whoever's watching. And so they were expected to be at the keyboard and going through the exercises and stuff. And that went really well. And so with Epic React, I decided to do the whole thing like that. And so that came out in 2020, and it went really quite well. And I just bought into this idea of doing things as self-paced workshops that you can go at your own pace, and with my videos kind of going along the way, helping you through all of the material. So I'll introduce the problem, then you go and try and solve it, and then you come back and watch me solve it. That is kind of the flow there. So Epic React was just enormous. There are lots of resources around React, but there's nothing quite like Epic React at all in the world that will like let you work in your own editor on your own machine, running through these exercises that have been handcrafted by me, that having delivered this material so many times. So what happened after that? Like I said, I am long-winded, but I will get to your question. So you're asking, what about Epic Web? Like, where did that come in? So after I finished with Epic React, actually taking a step back, one of the things that I was concerned about going full-time teacher is that I would lose touch with what it's like to build applications. I'm just always teaching and making little demos. Like, yeah, that works in a little demo, but like I live in the real world, Kent, and this is totally different. And so after I launched Epic React, and around the following year, Ryan and Michael, well, actually, it was that year. Ryan Florence and Michael Jackson were working on Remix, and I was very interested in what they were doing. And so when they launched Remix under developer preview license, I got a license and started working with that. And I decided, okay, I'm going to build my website, but I'm not going to do like what people typically do with the developer portfolio with like 3 pages and like 4 blog posts. At the time, I actually already had many blog posts, but I want to go way above and beyond, because this is how I gain experience in what it's like, and staying up to date with what it's like to build full applications. So I had a couple of requirements for myself. One, it needed to be globally distributed, not just the application code, but also the database, so that it could be as fast as possible. And that right there adds an enormous amount of complexity to the application that I thought made it feel a lot more like what I was building at PayPal. And so that was one big requirement. Another was that it needed to be server rendered and dynamic. For every user, every page should be different. So I can't use any CDN caching. It's not a static site. It's got to be fully dynamic. And then I those were probably like the biggest things that I had as requirements. I also wanted like features that my existing site already had, like integration with my podcast. I have a Chats with Kent podcast that I publish on my website. So I wanted to have that integration there. And yeah, a couple other little things. But I started working on that, and I worked with a team as well. So, to make sure that like I can still work with teams. And so I hired people to do design and illustration, and even to implement some of the designs and that sort of thing. And I was just kind of in charge of making sure the whole project got done. And I worked on the vast majority of it myself. So as I was going through it, and I decided to use Remix, I found out like how capable Remix was, and that I could build so much more than I ever expected. So in addition to all of the things that I mentioned, I also decided, okay, we can actually do user accounts, and we can give personalized blog post recommendations, like content recommendations to people based on things that they've already read and things that they haven't read yet, and things that are popular. So I can keep track of the blog posts that are being read and surface those. And then actually, let's make this a fun thing. So when you sign up for an account, you choose a team, and then your team, like the blog post that you read will count to points towards your team. And so then like it turns into like a Pokemon Go gym type of thing. So like if you have more people owning or having read this blog post more recently, then your team is the owner of that blog post, and the whole thing changes to your team's color and stuff. And then I was like, how about we do a call-in podcast where people can like write in the browser, record themselves asking a question, and I'll record my response. And so like now it's a full-on podcasting app that I've built. And so all of these different things that I could put together because the technology that I was working with was so good. So in the process of doing that and launching that, I said, okay, this is my next thing. I want to teach people how I did this. And that was really the intent the entire time. Was like, I need to think of what I want people to learn next. I want to teach people, really, for a long time, I've always wanted a kcd.edu. Like everything that I know about everything, I'm going to teach people. But to be able to do that, I have to really know my stuff. And so I'm going to build something really ambitious. And so that's what happened with the website. I decided to take a brief break on the teaching thing, though, because Remix needed somebody to come and help build the community and work on the documentation and examples and education and stuff. And so I actually joined Remix as a co-founder for about 8 months. And I ran the conference. I got meetups going. I got the Discord in a really good state, and a bunch of other things there. Helped with documentation and examples and stuff like that. And so once I felt like Remix was in a good place, then I said, okay, now I can go back and do teach people how I built KentCDodds.com. And so that is where Epic Web, at least Volume 1, that's where that has come from, is it's effectively, if I were building an ambitious, large-scale application today, this is how I would do it. There's a lot more to say about all this, but I've been talking for too long already. But I'll just mention that like what distinguishes Epic Web from Epic React is that, first of all, the learner environment, the workshop application that you use when you're going through the exercises, is much improved because I built it with Remix instead of Create React App. And of course, like all of my past experience in what makes a really good workshop app. And so that is one aspect that's different. And then, of course, Epic Web is about full stack application development, whereas Epic React is scoped down to just the React side of things. And it is focused on the single page app era of development, whereas Epic Web is about full stack apps. And so, yeah, that is the long answer to your simple question.
No, that's great. I appreciate the detail and all the background and context. But one of the things you talked some time ago about was this idea of making like the course like more of a workshop, more interactive, and that was like an improvement in terms of people's like learning cycle. And one of the things that I always recommend to people when, people are interested in getting into engineering, or they come to me and they're like, how do I learn like a new programming language or something like that? I'm like, choose a project, like, choose like a reasonably like simple project that you're interested in and just like start building, because you're going to learn so much more by the act of building than, just reading about it or something like that. So I think that's really, really great. But one of the things I'm curious about is, as you're putting together these courses and you're having people go and sort of self-direct to try to solve a problem, how do you balance like essentially what is difficult enough so that they're learning, but is still attainable for them to actually achieve that thing?
That is a great question. Some of that comes down to the assumptions you can make about their prerequisites. So they need to have a certain amount of knowledge about like some foundational knowledge for the material. So depending on what I'm teaching, like if we're going into, I'm going to teach you how to do full stack web authentication, then I have to assume that you know how to create a form and how to store data in a database and that sort of thing. So there's definitely some level of prerequisite knowledge that I will expect, and I always list on the workshops that say, this is what I expect you to know before you work on this workshop. Aside from that, once you're with those prerequisites, taking a complicated problem and breaking it up into multiple steps helps a lot with not overwhelming people and making sure that it's scoped really nicely. And then another thing that I do that's kind of unique to my workshops is I actually have the workshop app that you're or the playground that you're working in that has all of the code that you're going to be editing and things has little code comments with emoji that like draw your attention. The Cody the koala is like my main character in that, and so the Cody koala emoji shows up and says, okay, this is where you're going to do this. And you're supposed to follow the emoji and do what they say. And sometimes it can feel, or people will look at that and say like that, you're just like holding my hand. I'm not actually learning anything. You're just telling me exactly what to do. But I've had like tens and tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who've gone through my workshops with this format, and they really like it. It really, whether they like it or not, it actually is irrelevant. It has results. They remember the stuff that they're learning and they're applying it in their work. So I am, to help avoid people getting super lost and confused and frustrated, I am pretty handholdy in that way. And then another thing that I do is with a new workshop app, I have a tab that you can open up if you get stuck and you say, what is like something I am doing is different from what I see him doing in the video. What did I miss? And so it's a diff tab where you can actually look, and it generates a Git diff based on what you currently have in your playground versus what the solution looks like. And so if you really get stuck, you can just go and look at that. And then breaking it down to smaller bits and then iterating on that helps a great deal. And that actually, by doing that over the course of many workshops, like we do with the volume 1 of Epic Web, we can like start together from square one. And so by the time we get to the end of it, we may have a lot of code that's all like very domain specific and you gotta have pretty good understanding, but you built the whole thing. So like by this time, you know all of that stuff. And so it does help to like sometimes I'll have examples that are just like, okay, now for this example, we're going to learn these things. And now for this example, we're going to learn these things. They're totally different things. And sometimes that's kind of necessary. But if you can build on the same thing over the course of all of the different workshop exercises, then that helps a lot to avoid people having to context switch into totally different examples.
How long does it take, if someone's kind of working diligently at it to get through the entire course?
Okay, so there have been some people who had very aggressive schedules. And like I'm talking like maybe 20 hours a week or more of dedicated time in the workshop, who finished in 3 months. And so like that is way more than I would expect anybody to dedicate. And in fact, it might be too much because like your brain just needs time for this stuff to settle. And on top of the workshop exercises you're doing, it's important for you to, as you said earlier, build something yourself. And so what I suggest that people do is they spend about 6 hours a week at most working through the workshop material. And then they spend another, 6 or 10 hours working on some other project. Whether that could be something for work, but it's best to do something that's related to what you learned, so that your brain is forced to recall the information, and that will help with the retention. And so there have been some people who work through the workshop exercises, and then they go and build their own version of the app. It's even and it's fine if it's even the same thing. But yeah, it could maybe change up a couple features and whatever, make something a little different. That will really solidify that knowledge for you. But yeah, I see Epic Web Volume 1 as almost a university degree in the amount of content that you have in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really good advice around not sort of overloading yourself. I found when I was in university and I kind of really loaded up courses, I was so much in do mode that I didn't really have time to kind of marinate on stuff. So I didn't retain it as well. And I didn't really have time to kind of bring my own thoughts to it, because I was just basically in execution mode the entire time. So I think that's a really sage advice in terms of, if you want to sort of maximize the value of the course, is basically slow down a little bit and focus on quality, and give your time some time to think about what you're actually doing. In terms of the target audience, who is the typical sort of persona of a person that's going and taking this course? Are these people who are I don't know anything, but I'm looking to get into, land my first sort of job in tech? Or are these experienced professionals that maybe want to add another, thing to their toolkit?
Yeah. So the target audience I want to get is people who are on the job. They're their boss paid for it for them. The whole team got it together, and they're going through it together. And they're building a full stack app, or they want to. And that's the audience that I want to get. And we do sell team seats and stuff occasionally, but most of of the people who are taking it are single developers. They're maybe consultants, or they're doing this on the side. Some people are career switchers, and they want to level up. Other people, I've had a couple people take it who are just curious about what it's like to build full stack apps. I've had a manager or two who will get it just to stay sharp on the technical side of things. And so it is the target audience, or the audience that I attract is typically experienced developers, or relatively experienced developers. It's pretty beginner friendly, but it does expect that JavaScript and HTML and CSS. It's not going to teach you that stuff, and even TypeScript as well. So relatively experienced developers who want to upgrade their knowledge around building full stack applications.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What are your thoughts on the foundations of web development versus learning, a framework? And are the foundations of web development perhaps different than the sort of foundations of classical computer science education, where you're learning, data structures, algorithms, principles of programming, language design? Do you think we need to teach web development in a different way than we might teach classical computer science?
That's a great question. I definitely think yes to the last question you asked. We need to teach things differently, at least differently than I learned it, because I almost didn't become a programmer because it was so bad. We were learning about linked lists, data structures and things, and I was it just felt so disconnected from anything in the real world that I lost interest very quickly. And so it was only when I discovered information systems and we were trying to apply technology to business that it became interesting to me. And so I got lucky that I discovered that, programming can be practical. So yes, I think we do need to teach programming in general differently than than at least I learned at university. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with data structures and algorithms. I think a lot of people really get a lot out of that, and there are certain applications where that makes a lot of sense. I think for the vast majority of web developers, an understanding in data structures and algorithms is not going to hurt. But I do not think that I use any of my knowledge of that on a regular basis at all. So I do have some knowledge of DSAs, but I don't really feel myself reaching to that knowledge very often at all. So I don't, and for that reason, I don't teach any data structures and algorithms in Epic Web, not directly anyway. And the web is a little different from other platforms, but to be perfectly honest, I don't use other platforms. I'm fully 100% on the web, and so it's hard for me to compare and contrast those. I do think that the web is one of the best ways for a developer or for an individual to become a software developer and get a gainfully employed situation. And they don't have to be like a rock star at math, which is great because I'm not. So.
Yeah. So I guess like, it's not that there's not value in knowing data structures and algorithms, but maybe they're not as directly applicable to web development. But I guess like, what are those core principles for web development? Like, what are those things that you should know? You know, if you're building databases from scratch, you probably need to know as principles of that, data structures and algorithms and stuff. But if you're building web applications from scratch, like what are those core principles that I should know?
Oh, that's a good question. So typically, wherever you are in software development, I think it's a good idea to understand the level that you operate at and one or two layers below. What I say is like you go down to level up. So if you really want, like we're all learning at the layer that we're operating at. So I'm a web developer, so I know divs and spans, and I know class selectors, and I like all of these different tools that web developers understand. But then if you want to level up your understanding, then you can go a level down in the abstraction and say, okay, now I understand how the DOM works, and I know how the CSS OM works as well. And I understand how JavaScript is being executed and how the just-in-time compiler works and stuff like that. So yeah, the core principles, I think that like really just understanding the technologies of the web, it's a little less principle based, I guess. But the foundations of the web are important. HTTP, definitely an important thing for a web developer to understand. And like, cache headers and all of that stuff, like request response sort of things. On Epic Web, it's called Epic Web instead of Epic Remix because while I do use Remix to teach the web, I also like use various other tools to teach the web, and it's no more a Remix course than it is a TypeScript course or a database course, whatever. So what I do try to do in Epic Web is teach the foundations of the web platform. And so when we're talking about authentication, I'm not teaching authentication with Remix. I'm teaching authentication on the web, and here's how you use cookies and all these things. And now Remix is going to be the tool we use, but I want people to understand the underlying principles of how things like that work on the web.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. I like this kind of framework that you used of like, if I'm working at, this kind of certain level of abstraction, then going 1 to 2 levels beneath it allow me to understand that probably at a deeper level. But do I need to go 10 levels below that is probably not necessary.
Yes. And that comes through in my teaching by me. Typically, I will have somebody build the abstraction before we use the abstraction. And so when I'm teaching React testing library, we're going to build our own version of testing library before we start using it. And that just helps a lot with people's comprehension and effectiveness at using the tools. Like in Epic React, the very first lesson, we don't even use React at all. We make DOM nodes with the DOM API, and we insert those into the document. And then when we do bring in React, we don't start with JSX either. We're using writing by hand the compiled version of React so that people understand how JSX works. So yeah, that comes through in my teaching as well, because I do think that's an important principle.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit about JavaScript frameworks. We've had so many frameworks over the years, and it seems like there's a new one all the time. And I vividly remember the first time I encountered like jQuery and then Backbone back in the day, and those were like giant leaps forward from just writing vanilla JavaScript. And of course, now we have much more powerful frameworks at our disposal. But what are your thoughts on why the I don't know if it's the web ecosystem or maybe the JavaScript ecosystem, like we're perpetually kind of unhappy with the frameworks that are available and keep creating new ones?
Yeah, so the JavaScript ecosystem is unique because it's where everybody else converges. No matter what you're building, our users expect a user experience that requires JavaScript in the browser. They are done with full page refreshes. They're done with not having their cursor focus managed properly. Like everybody, no matter how you're building on the web, you're going to have to write JavaScript at some point, or you're going to use something that compiles to JavaScript. And so for that reason, we've got vastly different ecosystems and different minds of how we build software, all participating in the discussion on how do we build, the JavaScript side of things. And so because of that, I think those sensibilities are reflected in the tools and frameworks that are developed for the web. And so, we just have different different thoughts around how to do that. And I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing. Like we don't have to have one winner of all the things. It's just what speaks most to your own sensibilities for building for the web.
Yeah, and it seems like there's sort of different schools of thought in terms of like where things should happen. There was a time like in the early days of web development, basically like all the heavy lifting was like server side, and then your front end was pretty bare bones. And then eventually we shifted to like doing a lot of heavy lifting on the front end, and then there's probably some happy medium in there as well. I guess like from your experience, what do you think is the right balance?
That's a great question. So this kind of gets into the framework architecture or web architecture that I've dubbed the PESPA. So we have the MPA, that's the multi-page app, which it wasn't called that back then because it was the only way to do it. So like it was building websites. But that's just where every interaction is a navigation. Like you click a link, you go somewhere, you submit a form, you go somewhere, and it's a full page refresh, all of that. And that became problematic because users don't want full page refreshes when they're liking a post or whatever. And so we added a progressively enhanced version of that where JavaScript on the page would take over. And when you add a comment on GitHub, instead of a full page refresh, it just like shows up right there. But there were big challenges with that because now you're duplicating your templates between your Ruby backend that's generating HTML and your JavaScript client that's generating DOM nodes that should resemble the exact same HTML. So if the user refreshes, the comment looks exactly the same. And so for that reason and various others, we decided, well, this is really challenging. How about we just throw away all of the template stuff on the back end, and now our back end is just a REST API, and we can have the front end client side stuff just do fetch requests, and it can be in charge of all UI related stuff. And that actually feels like a really clean separation, right? Like JavaScript is in charge of UI and Ruby is in charge of our API. And what's wrong with that? Well, there's a lot of things wrong with that. It definitely solves some significant problems with developer experience, which does feed into user experience as well. Like if your developer experience is so bad that you have to keep on updating 2 copies of the code or whatever, your users are going to experience bugs. Like things are going to look different. It's going to be a pain for them. So it did sort of improve some areas of user experience as a result of the developer experience improvements there. But yeah, at the same time, there were a lot of other problems because now because you're not server rendering, your users are getting a bunch of loading spinners all over the place, and there's just the performance is going to be worse. Lots of things are a problem there, and so. Single page apps kind of took over for a long time. There was the Jamstack that got really popular for a while, and static apps, and so like all of these solutions to the problem that was invented by this architecture. So like incremental static regeneration, this whole entire really complicated solution, ISR, that was built to solve the problems that wouldn't exist if we just stayed with server-side rendering stuff. And so in my mind, the the pinnacle of user experience and developer experience is the progressively enhanced single page app. So it's like taking all of the good things of both a multi-page app and a single page app and putting it together where instead of having two copies of the same code, you've got or like, two copies of the same template, one in Ruby and one in JavaScript spaghetti. You've just got one source of truth for your templates, and that's your React components. And those run both on the client and on the server. And now we don't have to have that code duplication, but we also can have all of the dynamic stuff that our users have come to expect from the single page apps. And we can render it on the server and pick it up on the client. And then even in the near future, I think the PESPA architecture evolves into what is being worked on on the React team with React server components. And now some of those components can actually stay on the server. They don't need to go over to the client. But we still maintain that primary benefit that like it's still progressively enhanced, it's server rendered, the forms still work, the links still work, even if the JavaScript isn't finished loading yet. The transitions between pages are really fluid, no full page refreshes, and focus management is really nicely handled for us, all of that stuff, because we have JavaScript in the browser. So it's like a mix of the MPAs and SPAs that I think is the pinnacle of architecture on the web.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely want to talk more about what you sort of term as PESPA in your really great article, The Web's Next Transition, which I'll link in the show notes. And I encourage anybody listening to definitely read it. It's really fascinating and a great sort of history of all the different ways of essentially built web applications over the last 20 years or so. But one of the things I wanted to touch on before we get there was through these history, we're kind of like trying to balance this trade-off between like creating a better user experience, but also not like punishing our developers with like duplication of code and coding in one language and context switching to another language between the front end and the back end. Is there, because we keep kind of like having to like hack these systems together to get something better, like is like the raw materials of how we build web applications just like broken? Like do we need to basically revisit the like fundamental like HTTP and how some of this stuff works? Like, is that sort of paradigm maybe the problem? And we keep trying to like tool our way into something that works, but the kind of raw materials are broken.
That is a very good question. There are definitely a lot of people who would say yes, absolutely. And I would say there are plenty of things on the web that should not be the way that they are, but are that way because of backward compatibility requirements and things. The web is just really unique in that way. Like you can say to iPhone users, sorry, your iPhone is like 6 years old. We cannot support with new OS updates or anything. And as the operating system updates and as we get rid of old phones and stuff, we can have completely like breaking changes to that platform. Well, we can't do that on the web because there's no central authority saying whether or not, sorry, your website is 10 years old and it can't work anymore. Like I'm glad that we are in that state. That there's no central authority saying whether or not I can have an old website that still works. And so we do have unique constraints on the web that I think if we were to just like throw it away and build it from scratch, I hope we wouldn't lose those constraints because I think those are important for democratizing what the web is. And so I don't think that there's a really great reasonable way for us to say that like, yeah, if we did throw it all away and build something completely from scratch that didn't have those limitations, but we maintain those constraints, we'd have the same problem in 20 years. We just like, who knows what the future of the web will look like, even if we rebuilt it from scratch today. And so, yeah, like there are some platform issues, like certainly with the UI elements that you can use. And there's a bunch of component libraries that I wish didn't have to exist, but do for accessibility reasons and things. So, and then, yeah, even with HTTP, there are some improvements that could be had there. And like some things are evolving. The challenge is though, that like, what one of the things that's unique about the web and why it sometimes, the platforms move at a pace that's a little slower than a lot would like, is because that the people on those committees, I've been on that the TC39 committee. I know what this is like. Every decision that we make is set in stone forever, and so we have to be very careful about the advancements that are there, and then at the same time we have to make sure that it doesn't conflict with anything of the past. So yes, there are definitely holes in the web, but those holes exist for a good reason, and that is the importance of backward compatibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a really, really interesting and valid point. Is just that the web works in a way that's like different than almost any other type of like application you're building for, because of this. You basically need to adhere to like the legacy. Like a web application built in 1995 still should be able to render on someone's browser the way it did. Hopefully it's a little faster now because you're not connecting with a 56K baud modem or something. But like fundamentally that the building blocks still should be able to do that. Should be able to run that. But you couldn't run a modern application on Windows 95 today. So it's a completely different paradigm. And there's both, pros and cons to kind of adhering to that historic history there. And it would be difficult to kind of just decide like we're going to dismantle the system and start something brand new. And that might also not necessarily get you to what you are hoping to achieve anyway. So we kind of have to work within the constraints of the system that we put in place.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually been tried at least once, and I'm sure many other times. And in fact, it may still be an effort, an ongoing effort. But Douglas Crockford, famous for JavaScript, the good parts and stuff, and also not being a very nice person online. But he when he was at PayPal, he was trying to reinvent the web with various things, ideas of different technologies that he thought were better, and doesn't have the legacy and all that. It does not work. It doesn't. And actually, Google tried to reinvent the scripting language with Dart. And that language is still relevant. They have their Flutter thing. I don't really know much about that. I did write a Dart program once. But yeah, certainly I can't claim any knowledge around that, really. But that also failed. Because the other thing is, because there's no central authority, you have to get a group of people, of different companies, to agree on everything that happens. And so Google says, hey, we're going to do this Dart thing. And Apple and Mozilla are like, well, have fun with that, I guess. And so now, works on Chrome is slapped on any site that wants to do Dart. And you're not going to convince any business person that like their users can only use Chrome. That just is not going to be a thing. So yeah, there are a lot of unique and interesting constraints on the web, and it has been tried to reinvent stuff, and it just has failed. So even if we wanted to, and even if we could, I think we'd end up in the same situation where we're like, oh man, we got all this legacy stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So I want to go back to the PESPA architecture, and can we walk through a specific example and kind of break down, what is with the toolkit that I would be using, and like where does different things basically happen front end, back end for us. Like, let's say I'm doing I'm creating an account. I have an account creation page. I'm going to submit a form. That's going to get saved, that information somewhere in a database or something like that. Essentially, where does the different parts of that code live, and how's that interaction in the PESPA architecture, maybe in comparison to like one of the prior architectures? Yeah,
sure. So in an MPA architecture, everything's on the server. The generating the HTML, all of that, everything is going to be on the server. The only thing that runs on the client is what the browser vendors wrote to run in the client when you've got these HTML elements. In a progressively enhanced multi-page app architecture, I call that the PEMPA. I don't think anybody's ever called that a PEMPA, but that's what I'm calling it. But in that architecture, you'll have like sprinklings of JavaScript on the client to make the experience better. So when the user submits things, maybe it does a full page refresh, or maybe it's going to do some validation on the client before you submit to say, hey, that username has already been taken or whatever. And maybe you'll have some localized loading spinners and stuff. You hit sign in and it does a little spinner. So that's progressively enhanced. So it still works even if you don't have JavaScript, but if you do, then we can make it better. And in the SPA architecture, so you're going to have REST endpoints that actually do validation and stuff. You always want to have validation on the back end for sure, no matter what architecture you have. But yeah, this is going to be a lot more stuff happening on the client where validation happens on the client. Like you will do some client-side validation just for a better user experience. But again, all validation finally does happen on the server. Yeah, you'll be making fetch requests. You'll prevent default on your forms so it doesn't do a full page refresh, and you just do like a fetch request with JSON and stuff. Certainly does not work without JavaScript at all. In fact, for a lot of apps, it won't even show you the login form or the account creation form if you don't have JavaScript on the client, which is to say, like, everybody's got JavaScript on the client. Almost everybody supports running JavaScript. There are edge cases where it may fail to load or somebody turns it off for some reason, but like that is such an edge case. So it's not so much about like that it matters that it doesn't work without JavaScript. It's more about how quickly does it show up for the user, and will it work without JavaScript while we're waiting for the JavaScript to download? That's what we're talking about here. So anyway, in the SPA architecture, we move a lot of our business logic over to the client about like what are we going to render and when, and then the server just becomes APIs. In the PESPA architecture, you move. If we're moving from SPA to PESPA, we move tons of our stuff back to the server. And so handling that form submission, there's going to be just the tiniest little bit of JavaScript that says, okay, don't do a full page refresh. And then I'm going to submit this form as if it had been submitted by the browser. And then our server-side code doesn't know or care whether it was submitted by the browser itself or submitted by JavaScript. It's going to look the same as far as the server code is concerned. And so like all the business logic will be on the server. The like deciding what to render is going to be shared between the client and the server. And so the router is going to work on both sides. And then the like what data to load, that's going to be hooked into some sort of router of some kind. And lots of that can live on the server. And with React server components in particular, we can actually move even more of that logic over to the server, which ultimately is going to help a lot with the performance of your application, not just in the initial load time, but also as like you're making changes to things and things are re-rendering, that should speed that up as well.
Is the main advantage of moving from like the SPA to the PESPA like a performance gain? Especially like if you're on like let's say you're on a like a lower end mobile device, then having to download the JavaScript and render everything client side is going to really be like device dependent, and you only have so much control as an engineer to be able to like optimize that experience for your user.
That's a big part of it. Another big part is the developer experience as well. So it's both the user experience and developer experience improvement, because the fact is that the developer experience of a multi-page app is really simple because it's HTTP is stateless. And so you don't really think about managing state when every single time a user performs some sort of action like clicking on a link or submitting a form, they're getting a brand new version of your app that has got the latest of everything that was just generated by your server. You've got a little bit of state in there regarding like cookies and stuff. But for the most part, it's all just like request response, easy peasy. And so this is actually one of the reasons why a lot of developers who've been around for a while lament the way that things work now, because it's so much harder than it used to be. But the reason that it's harder is because now with single page apps, you're loading up all of this data into the client. And then as the user's making changes, you have to both change it in the client and you have to change it on the server. And so because what you effectively have is a cache. And so now you're just inviting one of the hardest problems in computer programming in the software industry is cache invalidation. And so you're just bringing that into your entire application. Now your entire app is a cache. And so that makes things really complicated. And so if you can embrace the fact that what you have on the client is a cache, then that does simplify things a great deal. Yeah, like a big part of the PESPA architecture is marrying the nice developer experience of a multi-page app with the nice user experience of a single-page app. And so that's the idea behind that. Now, you can actually get some of that nice developer experience improvement on a single-page app architecture by modeling things properly and saying, yes, this data is a cache, and I'm going to do the same thing the browser would have done, which is anytime the user submits a form, all the data is invalid, and I'll just go revalidate it all. And that actually is a pretty winning solution to this particular problem. And Remix has built SPA mode in part because there are some applications that cannot get away from the SPA architecture. They're an embedded iframe on somebody's website. They need to be a SPA for that reason. And so for various other reasons there. And so, yeah, you can get lots of the developer experience improvements there. But moving things back over to the server, to get back to your question, yes, that primarily is a performance improvement.
Yeah, one of the things that really kind of like annoyed me as I started to build with like a SPA architecture was the fact that like suddenly I had to start like managing history and state and all this sort of stuff that like you just kind of took for granted was done for you. And I was like, well, why is this so difficult? We had this problem solved, and now we've like reintroduced this problem all of a sudden. And of course, there's certain advantages that you got, but like it was like felt more difficult than what you could do previously. So in terms of like PESPA, is this something that you're seeing, like, is this basically from your opinion and also from what you're seeing in the industry, like how like modern applications are going to be developed now? Or is this kind of more like the future where you think things are going?
This is the way that I've been developing for the last three or 4 years now with Remix. For me, I'm unaware of any other framework that was capable of doing what Remix does. And so I give, at the time that Remix was released, and so I give Remix the crown of introducing the PESPA architecture, even if they don't like saying that, because in Remix, you can actually mix and match different architectures in the same application. And there are use cases for doing that. But I pretty much my entire app is a PESPA with the way that I build it. And so I've been doing this for a long time. And it's a trend that I've seen in the industry that whether you're using Remix, most application frameworks are moving to this architecture, even outside of the JavaScript ecosystem. So within JavaScript, you've got Svelte, you've got Next.js, and there are various others, Solid Start, Quick Start, all these frameworks are consolidating on this PESPA architecture. Even if they don't call it that, that's effectively what it is, because it's a really good architecture. And then outside of the JavaScript ecosystem, you have Phoenix, and you've got LiveView, and even Rails is trying to do stuff that follows this architecture. They're limited because they are so dedicated to not writing JavaScript that you have to have some layer between you and the JavaScript. But they are trying to do something similar to this architecture. And so, yeah, it is definitely, it's the present for many developers, and it's the future for pretty much most of us.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then as we start to wrap up, I want to go with some quick fire questions here. So don't think too hard about these. Just go with your gut. So if you could master one skill that you don't have right now, what would it be?
Slowing down.
What wastes the most time in your day?
Email.
If you could invest in one company, who would it be?
Tesla.
What tool or technology can you not live without?
My air filter.
Which person influenced you the most in your career?
My wife.
That's a good answer. What's your probability that AI equals doom for the human race?
My probability? I'd say 0.
All right. Well, that's great, Kent. Thank you so much. Would you anything else you'd like to share? How people can reach out to you or follow you online?
Yeah, so I have many places. So KentCDodds.com is my personal website. That's where you can go and ask me a question on the Call Kent podcast. I also have office hours. I just finished that before recording this. So you can join me for my office hours each week. I'm on X at Kent C Dodds, and I also on epicweb.dev. I'm actually just barely scheduled a bunch of React workshops. So anybody who wants to learn React can go through this masterclass of 7 workshops over 5 weeks, 10 days worth of workshops. It's going to be pretty intense, and it'll be awesome. And then in April, we're doing Epic WebConf, which will be awesome.
Is that your own conference?
Yes, yeah. So it's an evolution of RemixConf. Now that RemixConf isn't happening anymore, so I've just taken that and made it my own. So yeah, you definitely know some of the speakers there, and you'll love to get to know the other speakers that will be there. So it's in Utah, and it's a really awesome time of year to be in Utah.
Fantastic. And then do you have any speaking gigs coming up?
Yes, I do. I have a map of all the places I'm going to be. If you go to kcd.im/map, that will show you all the places I'm scheduled to be and when I'm going to be there. I'm going to be in Miami, Poland, New York, various other, here in Utah, of course. And so, yeah, that's a good way to keep up with where I'm going to be.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Kent, for being here, and hopefully you can join us again down the road.
Well, thank you, Sean. I appreciate the time.
Cheers.